we're really excited about today's program and the great panel of media professionals who have agreed to serve on our panel. So as Melissa mentioned, the topic of the program is truthfulness, fairness, and standards of decency, perspectives on ethics from media leaders. Now, we're all consumers of media, whether we get our news from print, TV, radio, or online sources. What we may not often think about, though, is how those stories are gathered and produced, the decisions that are made every day behind the scenes to ensure that the news we see is fair and accurate. And we want to give you a glimpse into that process today. To help us do that, we're fortunate to have a great panel of media professionals. They are longtime leaders in our state's media, and they all deal with ethical issues on a regular basis as part of their jobs. So I'd like to invite them up here, and I'll have them give a brief introduction of themselves and their organization, and then we'll get started.
Okay, I'm Lee Williams. I teach at Rogers State University, mainly journalism and video-related things, but I also teach public relations and corporate media production. My background is that I was the news director at KTUL for 8 years and a couple of other places before that, as well as working in St. Louis and Phoenix. Along the way as executive producer or producer, and have a reporter background before that, but now I teach college. I still do some freelance work for ABC, NBC, and the Weather Channel, mostly covering tornadoes and disasters, but sometimes covering controversies like the Robert Bates Reserve deputy incident, tragedy. So that's me.
I'm Jim Langdon, publisher of Tulsa People magazine. Langdon Publishing. We also publish Intermission magazine monthly for the Tulsa Performing Arts Center, and also the Tulsa Voice, Tulsa's alternative newspaper. I'm very proud to serve on this panel today and in this setting and for this organization. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Ellerbach. I'm the executive editor of the Tulsa World. I have been at the Tulsa World for 4 publishers. I'm very proud of that. I have been at the Tulsa World for 30 years, so I haven't been able to hold a job. I've been reporter, business editor, business reporter, state editor, managing editor, and they finally got tired of me still being there, so now I'm the executive editor. I'm very happy to be here today. Somehow I missed the bow tie memo, but you know, I think I'll get by. So thank you for inviting us, and we're happy to be here.
I'm Ted Struley. I'm the editor of the Journal Record, and now I know what I'm getting Susan for Christmas. I've been the editor of the Journal Record for 11 years or so, and previously worked in the newspaper business in Texas for about 12 years, and California for some time before that, adding up to, 27 or 28 years or so. Glad to be here.
What we'll do is I'll ask a few questions just to get us going, but then we really would love to have questions from you guys as well, just to answer any questions you may have about how the media deals with ethics. So just first question to start off with, for each of you, what types of ethics do you employ on what you report on and how you report on it? Susan, do you want to kick it off?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Barrett.
Well, ladies first.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I think sometimes people miss the fact that journalists as a whole, or the journalists that I've worked with over my career, are very ethical people. They want to get the facts right. In my newspaper, the news section is separate than the opinion section, so we deal in facts. We try not to get opinion into the news articles. We get accused of that often, but I think sometimes in this world of you can turn on a broadcast station to match your opinion, sometimes they don't understand that most newspapers are trying to present facts in a very ethical and straightforward and honest way. So in doing that, one of the things that we try to do is get a diverse section of sources, so that if we have something that's presented, that we get the other side, so that we present two sides to the picture, that we have the pros and the cons. Are we successful in that in every story? I can't tell you that we are, but we do try to do that. So I think that would be the thing that I would stress at the Tulsa World on the news side, is that we try to get a diverse opinions in the paper, and we try to be fair and accurate. And I know that other news organizations claim that also, but I think that any good news organization, that should be a standard for them.
I'll throw my 2 cents in as long as we're on newspapers. I think it's been a great job for me all these years, because the job description is pretty simple. It's be fair and tell the truth. And as long as you do that, you can't get too far off the right road. I'll take what Susan said, though, and just as food for thought, kind of take that a step further. We do. It's one of those unique things about journalists. Andy Rooney said it once on Actors Studio, is, we actually sit around and spend our lunch hour arguing about the ethics of our profession. There aren't not a lot of jobs where you do that, I don't think. But it's a critical conversation in every newsroom that I've ever worked in, and what makes it challenging is that we set out to present all sides of the story. Sometimes there's more than two, and we set out to do that in a fair way. Where it becomes difficult when you're trying to be the eyes and ears for somebody else is that if one source tells you the sky is blue and the other source tells you the sky is pink, it would be really irresponsible to simply report both of those points of view as though they were equally credible, because then we wouldn't be telling you the truth, right? Our job at that moment is to look up and see that the sky is blue and the guy that's telling us it's pink is crazy. And we need to report to you that this is credible and that this isn't, because if we do that, we're telling the truth. So there's a lot of levels to it, but I think at least the next level up from what Susan described is that we also, on a regular basis, have to employ a filter on your behalf.
Lee, from a broadcast perspective, how do you employ ethics and how do you approach it?
Well, it's the same as print. We really do. Number one, we're really not out to get you. And number two, we really do care about the truth. When there are bad apples, they're drummed out of the business really fast. If people do it by mistakes, if they keep making those mistakes, they lose their jobs. If they do it on purpose, they lose their career forever. And there are lots of examples in the New York Times and where you've had journalists who made up stories, and when it's found out, they get fired, never work again. Plus, their supervisors get fired. You also have Dan Rather in the unfortunate end when he reported that George W. Bush about his military record, and all the producers, there's a great movie about it, it's showing at Circle Cinema right now. All the producers on that got fired. Dan Rather, of course, got eased, kind of pushed out the door over a period of the next 6 months. But it's very serious. I think the bigger problem comes from ignorance. Your reporters have a liberal arts education. They come out of school, and they don't know very much. And liberal arts, I just mean general studies, not liberal media, just general studies. They don't know very much, and they go to work in a market smaller than we are. If they're lucky, in 2 years, they get to the Tulsa market where they can make more money. But they're ignorant. So you have to realize that they don't really know enough yet to do the job they've been asked to do. That gives you some advantages in which you can guide them. It gives you some disadvantages that they may be overzealous and get it wrong because of a lack of understanding or over desire to have a hot story. They'll heat it up too much, or they'll just misunderstand it. So I think a lot of times it's education level more than any purposeful intent when things are not in balance.
Okay. And Jim, I know not every news organization deals with breaking news. I mean, Tulsa People hits the newsstands every month. How do you deal with the issue of ethics and making sure what you produce is fair and accurate?
Well, I think it's quite simple, and it's not so simple today because we live in a very chaotic media world, inhabited both by professional journalists and amateur citizen journalists, primarily in the digital space. But true journalism is all about gathering of facts and then presenting those facts in a way that's truthful, objective, and fair. And so I concur with everything that's been said here, that I think the first place we start is by employing journalists who are committed to truthfulness, that they realize that telling the truth in their stories is what it's all about, and not intending to deceive the reader or the viewer or the listener.
Great, thanks. Okay, news organizations today are coping with financial pressures like everyone else, and often we've seen they're working with significantly smaller staffs than they were just a few years ago. So I think we're curious, how do you ensure that your staff has the tools and the time that's needed to report accurately? They may be doing more jobs, they may be covering several beats, they may be covering companies they don't know as well. So how do you make sure that they have all the tools that they need to succeed?
Well, I think it starts in the hiring process, and just by hiring journalists who are hopefully trained, who have some experience. A great value to me was going through, journalism school, learning about the code of ethics in journalism, really appreciating and valuing the craft and the importance of what we do in communications. I think there's a lot more pressure on us now in relation to that question. We're requiring more out of people. It's a kind of and more so for my colleagues here. The practice of professional journalism is conducted at a blurring pace. And I know, Susan, I talked to a former world reporter a couple of years ago, and he said, we used to, what we were about was breaking a story ahead of the Daily Oklahoman. He said, now it's important for us to break a story before it's on a television news website. And that just increases the speed and the pace of, I know, your business. And fortunately, in our business, it's slower. We're more feature-oriented in Tulsa People, of course, and a little more commentary-oriented in the Tulsa Voice, but we have a lot more time to practice.
I think that's right. I mean, we are with a smaller staff. I've been pretty fortunate in the last couple of years. We haven't really had any, reductions in force other than some attrition. So I think that we've been very fortunate at that. But we have lost a lot of experience in our newsroom and newsrooms across the country. And while it is important in the hiring process, what we look for is somebody that has the good skills as a journalist. That could be they've covered something else at another publication. We feel that if you have those skills as a journalist, that you can cover pretty much any beat. What that means is that, now we have, where we used to have separate reporters for the energy sector, the financial sector, the aerospace sector, the real estate sector, all of those kinds of sectors, now we may have a reporter who's covering, several of those. That requires probably not as much in-depth. I think that's what's been lost a little bit as far as daily newspapers, because like Jim mentioned, we are competing 24/7 these days. While we do want to get things up before a broadcast station website has it up, we don't want to be wrong. We don't want to have to take that down right away. So in our shop, it is get it right and then get it up. So that's what we try to do, and we've been pretty successful at that. I think that we can always be better. We hire good people. We have, some of the best journalists that I'm working with right now are some of the ones that I've hired the most recently. They're dedicated. They want journalism to last. They want to see this profession continue. They want to be professional. They want to compete. those kind of things. And that's why I got into journalism school. So it's kind of refreshing to see that coming out of journalism schools these days. My hope is that we can continue to provide those jobs for them.
One of the things that's happened in the broadcast side is it's typical. We're going to add 20% more news time. We're going to give you 5% more staff, if that. So that puts pressure to get more and more news from outside sources, whether it's network or wherever, video news releases, big in public relations, that sometimes go in the air without any note at all that this video comes from a public relations and a company focus, and it's hidden as a news story. So a lot more things like that happen. There's no doubt that it's more run and gun now. It's always been run and gun. I'm not kidding you, but it's more run and gun in the Tulsa market and markets all over the country now. More people doing more stories in shorter time to fill more shows, and that by the nature of it means more mistakes. So we've had the recession where almost all of us lost people, and then we've had the onslaught of the internet, which is both good and bad. The internet provides the potential of a bright future as we expand, and everybody has, but at the same time, stations don't make money or not very much money off the internet yet. The investment is very high, and the revenue is hard to make a profit off the internet. So it puts us in a real jam to get more shows out there with about the same number of people.
One of the questions I ask reporter applicants, since we're a business paper, is how they think the business beat is similar or different from other beats, sports or religion or lifestyle or whatever. And occasionally they answer by telling me that the business beat is all about the numbers and the spreadsheets and the earnings reports. And if they give me that answer, I don't hire them. The answer I'm looking for and the people I hire are the ones who say, there isn't any difference in the business beat and any other beat. They're all the same. We're writing about people, and we're writing about their challenges and their struggles and how they are successfully or unsuccessfully meeting those challenges. A good story is a protagonist and antagonist in a central conflict, and it doesn't matter if that's happening in somebody's office building or on a baseball diamond or in their living room or in their church. A good story is a good story. So I'm in league with Susan here that what I'm looking for is somebody who tells a good story and understands the basics of the job, because it really doesn't matter which beat I put them on, all those skills translate. I think where we've lost in attrition of experienced journalists over the last few years hurts us in their institutional knowledge and their Rolodex. Not that they actually still have a Rolodex, but the metaphorical Rolodex. And the sources that you develop, journalism's like any other business. It's about personal relationships. And when you're working one beat, if all you cover is the oil and gas industry in one city, you pretty quickly develop some very deep relationships with people in that business. And so you understand their business better, you learn things from them, they get to know you better and trust you more, and you come into stories that you might not get from someone you just met. And when you're covering multiple beats, it's not that you're any less equipped to tell those stories, but you don't have the opportunity to know as small a group of people as well as you do when you're only covering one specific thing. And that's a really subtle difference that most of you would not notice reading newspapers from one day to the next. But if you're in the newsroom, you can tell. Not that there's any difference in the ethics, but there's a difference in some of the stories you're getting and the depth of some of those stories.
Great. Let's talk social media. The media's always competed with each other to break a story first. With the advent of social media and 24-hour news websites, does this create even more pressure to get a story out fast, even before it's right?
Well, I think it does create some more pressure because, how many of you get your news from Twitter? Yeah, I mean, I do. So, I mean, that creates a lot of pressure, especially with people coming out of journalism schools. You know, they're tweeting. I mean, that's just what they do, how they communicate with friends and everything like that. You know, one of the questions that we had a little phone conversation before we had this panel, and one of the questions that Barrett said was, you know, what kind of mistakes have you made and everything? And so, and what have you had to take down off the internet or something like that? Well, our most recent mistake was from Twitter, because we had a young reporter out at a scene, a crime scene, and she reported on Twitter that the suspect was dead. He was very much alive. So we had to, you know, immediately, you know, have her take that tweet down and tweet out something else. So sometimes I think people get in too much of a hurry on Twitter. You know, on our website, it's a little more technical. We have a little bit more time to, you know, craft a story. And by a little more time, I'm talking like maybe a whole 60 seconds more time to craft. So we get a little bit better information, and it takes a little more time to post. So, but if you're getting your news off of social media, you can tell when something's happening, like the Paris attack last week. If you were watching Twitter feeds, you were getting a lot of different information, and it's up to you to filter it. You know, the good thing about a reputable news source like the Journal Record, the Tulsa World, Tulsa People, something like that, is that that's kind of filtered for you. I mean, if you want to hear all the rumors and innuendo and stuff like that, Twitter's your, you know, go-to. But I think that even though it's made it more competitive, and we do have people that are spending, you know, a lot of time on social media and on the internet, you can get, it also gives other journalists a little more time to follow up on that story and for in the paper later.
Back to my comment that reporters are ignorant, so let me put that in context. These are well-educated people and well-meaning people almost always. As I said, there are a few bad apples, but that's really rare. But they just don't know enough yet. They're generalists, and they may not know about this, cover the Bank of Oklahoma and understand financial transactions or Williams companies and understand oil and gas business. They just don't, and they're not going to unless they hang around for another 5 or 10 years. So the way we make that better is that everybody goes through an editor like Susan, or in TV stations, a producer. If the story's controversial, it'll go through an assistant news director or news director. So almost every normal story that gets in the newspaper, gets on TV, has gone through a more experienced person's eyes. And there's an opportunity to catch mistakes and put things in perspective. You know, when you're in social media, and I travel with a Channel 6 crew some this summer, it's just kind of a refreshment of my education. And yeah, they're out there at lunch, barbecue sandwich, and feeding all forms of Instagram and Twitter and the website, and there's no filter for that. So the chances of error are huge.
Well, yeah, on that, just to follow up on that, we're in our business and our publications with the frequency that we have, we're not as impacted by speed and in the internet. But you know, there's a big difference between journalism and activism, and so much of what I see across social media platforms is activism. It's people who are commenting on one side of a topic. We see that on television on occasion on some of our channels, and that's not journalism. And so that's very concerning to me as, you know, as a professional journalist. Do people have the ability to discern or distinguish activism, one-sided activism from true reporting and the true practice, you know, of journalism? And that's a big concern, and it also relates to our shrinking media companies and our shrinking newsrooms. Just the ability for us in journalism to do the job that needs to be done, which is an important protector of our democracy.
Great.
I think the motto, at least in most newspapers that I know of is, get it right matters more than get it first. So despite the speed pressure from social media, I think we're all pretty reticent to throw anything out there that we haven't verified, because it's such a fundamental tenet of what we do. I think the saddest day for me of the last 10 years, not literally, was we had a reader focus group, and we're asking them about their perceptions, and I was absolutely crushed to learn that they didn't give a hoot who had the story first. They didn't even know who had the story first. And you just watch a room full of journalists just sigh and tear up a little when they hear that, because that's part of the fun of the whole deal, is trying to be first. And not a single one of our readers expressed even the slightest interest in who had the story first. They all expressed great interest in who had the better version of the story. And often, no matter how fast we were putting it out, they weren't reading it immediately anyway. So they were going to read it later in the day or the next morning or whenever they got around to it on their lunch break, and they had no idea who had it first. But they were very much interested in who'd done a better job covering the same event. So it was sad, but it was a little bit of a wake-up call, and I think we took at least some of the pressure off ourselves about trying to be first, and we talk about that routinely in the newsroom, that nobody cares if we're first except us, right? Because we want bragging rights at the Chinese buffet when we run into reporters from other papers.
That's where we're eating now.
Yeah, I wasn't making that part up. That was real. And that's, really, there's a bragging rights thing, and it's fun to be first. But we've pretty much figured out that the only people who really care or notice are us. And so for our readers, we think about getting the story right and making it a complete story rather than beating somebody by, a minute and a half.
Someone had suggested this question to me. It's about the downside of media coverage. We've all seen people and companies deal with a crisis, a shooting at a store, food poisoning at a restaurant, financial problems at a local employer. It's legitimate news, but it often results in intense media coverage that can cause harm to companies and employees. What ethical standards do you follow to assure the news is fairly represented and covered by your reporters in these instances?
Part of the process, the journalism process, is fact-checking, making sure that a story written by a reporter or a feature writer is accurate, that it's fair, it's objective, and we employ that. I know all professional news organizations perform the fact-checking process just to make sure that a reporter is doing their job in being accurate and fair and objective. I wanted to add, Barrett, just a side note that the digital media landscape, which is getting broader and broader, is certainly one of the things that has created the shrinking companies and newsrooms across America in the world. People today are less dependent on traditional media, and I wish that were not true, but it is. And people today are reluctant to pay for anything. They don't want to pay for a subscription or online news. They want everything free, and so it's very much a changing, fundamentally changing industry that we're in, and it's irrevocable. It's not going to go back. So,
in breaking news and TV, that fact-checking process goes out the window. It's not unusual for something. I remember the Glenpool oil tanks that exploded, to some degree the Robert Bates deputy story, although not that type of explosions and tornadoes. It certainly has been a giant story where somebody came under the microscope and it's had terrible, terrible effects, things that normally either wouldn't have come to light have not only come to light, there's a spotlight on them and they're under a microscope. So we've seen our sheriff lose his job over problems and paperwork. There's so many years back, it never would have come back except for this tragedy. And then also, we had tragedies across the nation at the same time that were much worse than ours in terms of, we saw the police officer shoot the guy 6 times in the back. And we had choking and a series of those stories, which made our story gigantic. When it normally would have been a big story and a bad story, but it wouldn't have been a national story. So I was hired by ABC to follow the story locally. So all the networks were in on it too. So that's what can happen when you get under a microscope, whether it's an explosion at an oil and gas plant or maybe a unbelievable embezzlement or something like that. And it is punishing, it's terrible, and it is unfair as well that you get put under a microscope and some of the information comes out that's wrong. So that was actually the second point I was going to make. The first one on breaking news, it all goes out the window. You put an anchor on the set, you say start talking, and it's amazing that they develop these skills. I mean, literally within minutes. Okay, we got an explosion in Glenpool. Get on the set, start talking about it. Well, what about it? Well, here's 3 lines. As soon as we get somebody live out there, you can stop talking and go to them and let them talk for a while. So all that is not mediated in any way except they're reporting what they see. And mistakes almost always do happen in coverage like that. But that is the nature of the beast, and probably the equivalent of the newspaper is now you feed the internet almost live, almost instantly, and you guys have a great website, by the way, and you do feed it early and often.
Well, I would say that, I'm not sure scrutiny is unfair. I mean, I think sometimes when you're under considerable amount of scrutiny, there's a reason. It's not just that, we decide, we're gonna look at WPX this week, or something like that. There's usually what we call a nugget of news there, or there's a news lead. And my advice, and whenever I visit with people that work in the public relations business or whatever, is that to be as open and as honest as you can be with us. We want to put your side in. We want your comments. We want what your take is. And we understand, that when you're being bought by, a company out of Dallas, that you don't know what the, ramifications are going to be right away. But it's okay to say that. It's okay to say we're not sure what's going to happen right now or things like that. I think, sometimes y'all spend a lot of time, crafting a statement, which is good, but, sometimes if you can, just maybe, visit a little. But, when you're a public company, we understand that you can't always give us the information that we want. A lot of journalists work on background information. That's information that, for us is to have but not to print. And any ethical journalist would honor that. So I would say that when you're under scrutiny, and I'm sure you probably already do, but you have a plan of how to react to the press when we come calling, because, we will come calling. That's what we do, and even though we're smaller and nobody reads us and nobody wants to pay for us, we're still out there, and we're still going to call you because we do have a lot of people that are still interested in the news, and it actually, the audience is growing daily. I'm proud to say that. It is still a very vibrit business. It's not the same business as when I graduated from the University of Kansas and got into it, but it is a dynamic business, and we still have a lot of people looking to us for information that we would like to share with them, but you have to participate with us.
You just changed my answer.
Was that good or bad?
No, it was good, because
Okay.
I'm just going to say something different now. Newsrooms are sometimes a little rough around the edges when we talk to each other and the doors are closed. And one of the sayings that comes out of that is, there's no happy way to spin a dead baby, right? I mean, sometimes there are just very unhappy stories, and it's your job to report them, whether that's a business crisis or a personal crisis. And of the hundreds of stories a year I used to write, there's probably 5 that I can name off the top of my head. And one of those was covering a 2-year-old's funeral, who she had been shaken to death by her stepfather. There's no way to turn that into a happy moment, right? You can't do it. Is it really important to tell that story and to raise public awareness about what a problem that can be and what the dreadful consequences are? Sure it is, because that's how things change and how things get better. So it's a terribly important story to do, and it's a very sad, uncomfortable story to have to go write. Really, you don't want to interview that mother, but you have to, and somebody's got to be willing to do that. I'll expound for just a moment on what Susan said about transparency in crisis mode. I think the best case study of that is if you look at NASA in the 80s during the Reagan administration when the Challenger disaster occurred in Florida. NASA's decision was to say nothing. I mean, they pretty much just pulled down the curtains and refused to say anything. And if you go back and look at the national coverage of that tragedy, you'll see that generally the media was not very kind to NASA. If you compare that to the Columbia disaster 10 years or so ago, I happened to be covering Johnson Space Center at the time. And to refresh your memory, Columbia fell apart over Texas about 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Ron Dittemore, the shuttle program manager, held a press conference at 1 o'clock that afternoon for the handful of journalists who could get there that quickly. And if you're Ron Dittemore, that is the worst day you can imagine. I mean, there are no worse scenarios than what happened to you that morning. And they spent about an hour and a half answering every question everybody wanted to ask them. And they were willing to say, in a very unlikely governmental response, they sat there and said, we are not sure what happened, but at the moment, here's what we're looking at. This is where we think it might have gone wrong. And they were willing to speculate. They were willing to say, if this did happen shortly after the launch, which is what turned out to be the case, we had no way to rescue them. We could not have gotten them to the space station. They were on a different orbit. There was no way to get them there. There was, they explored all those questions that all of us had. And in the only time in nearly 30 years of doing this, at the end of a press conference, the journalists in the room stood up and gave him a standing ovation. He was under incredible pressure and the most miserable day of his life and was willing to sit there and say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is what we think. And I think if anyone were to compare the ensuing coverage of Columbia to the coverage of Challenger 20 years earlier, you would see that NASA was treated in the press much differently after Columbia than they were after Challenger, and that was why.
Great. Let's open it to questions.
Well, I think it's hurt. I don't think there's, because my brother-in-law thinks that Rush Limbaugh and I are, tight. So anyway, he thinks we're both journalists. I would argue that, but it's hurt us. I think like Jim was talking about earlier, you've got a lot of people online, on social media who think of themselves as journalists, who whether or not they do, they are trying to report like journalists, have been trained to report, and they're getting things wrong. They're putting in their opinions. They're slanting the news and things like that. And so I think for a lot of people, it makes it very difficult to judge who are professional journalists and who are not. You know, in journalism, you know, you get a bachelor's, you can get a master's, you can get a doctorate. I mean, we're not like, you know, the Public Relations Society of America, where you can become a fellow or things like that. So it's, you know, it's on your reputation, basically. And I think people who can't distinguish between professional journalists and others, those of us who make our living doing this on a daily basis, we've been hurt by that.
I think, yes, I have that conversation a lot, sometimes in my head, but a lot. And there's a popular bumper sticker at the moment, at least at my end of the turnpike, that has almost caused me several wrecks, that says, "I don't trust the liberal media," right? And every time I see that bumper sticker, I want to force them to the shoulder and get out of the car and go, who do you mean when you say that, right? Who exactly are you talking about when you make that statement? Because, you know, when you're talking about who's the media, we'd agree that probably CBS News and CNN and the New York Times and the Tulsa World, and I think we'd all agree that's part of the media, but then we have Rush Limbaugh and Maddow, and I mean, we can do it on both sides of, you know, are you including them when you say the media that you don't trust, that's too liberal? Are you including Fox News in that? Are you including, you know, are you including Stephen Colbert? Are you, you know, Bill O'Reilly? I mean, who all do you consider when you are making that statement that's part of the media? You know, does the Lost Ogle count?
I love the Lost Ogle.
I do too, but I'm not sure where you draw the line when you're making those generalizations about the media does this or the media does that. And I would challenge anyone who makes that statement. I mean, I always wonder, do they think the Wall Street Journal's too liberal, or the Oklahoman, or I never know who they mean. And I would challenge anyone who makes that statement or who accepts that statement without thinking about it critically to look at the news pages or the newscasts of any bona fide media, any legacy media, not the opinion page, read the news pages, and show me where that untrustworthy bias is appearing. I would be delighted to have someone point it out to me. Nobody's been able to do it yet. It certainly appears on opinion pages, but that's what opinion pages are for. They're for expressing opinion. I've probably rambled on way too long now, and I'll stop talking, but you can tell I get a little passionate about that one. And I think where that comes from are the wave over the last 2 decades or so of opinionators who are sort of disguising commentary as news.
Yeah, I always got a kick out of some people who thought Jon Stewart was a reporter, which he always rejected and disclaimed. But on your question, Steve, one of my overriding concerns is that we have too much politically partisan journalism in this country, and I know those of us in this room can recognize it and see it for what it is, but many people can't, I'm assuming. But I think it's really fueled the political gridlock that exists in this country. That it's that kind of information that's being put out there by a lot of the people we've already mentioned is not a good thing for our country. And I'm okay with varying opinions, but when news or opinion is disguised as news, it's very troubling because of those people who can't distinguish between fact and non-fact.
I call it big mouth blowhards on a 24/7 rant, and also about their particular slant. And I agree. I think it's bad for America. I think it's hurt us when most people got their stories from people who really did try to cover both sides, even though they didn't agree with both sides. We all have biases. Bias is different than a purposeful political slant, and then you constantly beat the drum to achieve your political slant. So I think it's not good, and I think you're right, Steve. A lot of people don't sort out the difference in commentary and editorialism versus news and facts as you can best get them, and the covering both sides, and it's it hurts.
Portray themselves as a journalist and get a story out within seconds. How do you react in this?
Well, I think you have to kind of choose your battles to a certain extent. I mean, it depends on what it is out there. I mean, we've seen things, picked up story tips on social media and, gone and checked them out. It's like what Ted was talking about earlier. We want to be right before we want to, be out there. And if that causes us to lose some traffic or sales of the printed product, then I think we're willing to do that. But what we want to do is, we've worked with those people. You're on the scene. What did you see? We've used them as sources. And then we try to get, we like to have two people telling us the same story before we report it. If we haven't seen it ourselves or reported it ourselves, so we'll take that interview and we'll credit them and with that reporting or with that analysis, not analysis, but that eyewitness report or something like that, and then we try to follow up with it and make sure that what this person has put out on social media is correct.
I had a happy moment a few weeks ago when the Lost Ogle, Patrick Riley, took a local television station to task for doing a poor job reporting a story. Right? And my frustration with the Lost Ogle usually is that Patrick thinks he's a journalist and he isn't. But it was really fun to watch him engage in this critical monologue over this TV story where a TV station had run with a piece of information from one source, and they hadn't developed it any further, and they hadn't looked for other sources, and what they ended up reporting was not at all a fair representation of what had occurred. And he really put aside the sarcasm for a minute and took them to task for that. And I was like, wow, good for you, Patrick. And the reason that excited me was because I saw it as maybe a hint that at some point the audience begins to recognize that there are well-reported professional stories, and there's chatter and rumor and innuendo, and they are two different things. And I think that the internet has, for what I hope is a brief period of time in the grand scheme of things, caused people to confuse those two things. And I think that at some point, or at least I'm hopeful that at some point, the dust settles and people again realize that there is a difference between professionally reported, fact-checked, vetted news and what somebody threw up on Twitter this afternoon. And I think eventually we get back to that point where people know the difference and they may enjoy hearing the quick stuff that's coming out early in a story, but they rely on what they're getting told from a professional news organization, because for those of us in the business for a living, and as Susan said, I'm willing to give up a few single copy sales or a little traffic on the website to make sure I get it right, because if we ever give up our reputation, we have absolutely nothing left to deliver, right? If I give up my reputation, you have no reason to read my paper, and I then no longer have an audience to deliver to advertisers, and now I'm out of business. So there is nothing we have to stand on or to offer other than our reputation for being fair and accurate all the time.
Melissa, I can't respond to that because of the type of publications that we publish. We're not impacted by that. But if I may, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege. This month we began our 30th anniversary year of Tulsa People, and our longest serving editor of the magazine is here, Missy Cruz. Missy, would you stand or wave? You know, it's because of the wonderful skills, talents, and professionalism of Missy that I'm sitting here today, and I very much appreciate her. And she continues to serve us as a consultant, an editorial consultant, so we get to see her not every day or every week, but several times during the month. Thank you, Missy.
So I think one thing is like any other source, you check it out. But one of the great things about social media, if something really explodes, like reporting an explosion, for example, and you get a lot of traffic, then you have a much better indication that something's really happening.
Right.
And maybe you just report that there's an enormous number of reports of tweets out there. Here's some pictures on Instagram. We haven't checked out the story yet, but we'll tell you more as soon as we find it. So it's tremendously valuable, and Facebook will often tell the stations important stories that are on. But like any other thing, you have to check it out because often what you think is happening at the beginning is not true or not quite true.
A good example of that was the OSU crash. I mean, social media had that story, light years before, traditional media did. And I think to a certain extent, that's, where you got the tip that all of a sudden you started seeing these horrific images on Twitter. And I think people, I think Channel 6 actually, they had somebody down there that was covering the parade, and so they got the jump on a lot of people. But that was such a breaking story, and I think a lot of news organizations actually, did exactly what you're talking about. They went to Twitter and they got sources off of Twitter and, tried to communicate with those people who were right there at the scene. And to be honest with you, I think that's kind of exciting. I mean, I think that's a good thing about, about social media and how journalists can work together because, I mean, if you're not on the scene, you don't have a firsthand account of what happened. And if you can connect with those people, immediately, I think that's better, reporting for everyone.
Native advertising, where advertising is presented in the news?
No.
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, that's something that we are continuing to talk about. I have a lot, one of the things that we talked about in our phone call was, what interaction do you have with advertising? I have interaction with advertising. I mean, I'm sorry, I confess, I have interaction with advertising. And we try to keep it at the Tulsa World, we kind of try to keep it at my level, that I talk to I go to an operations committee meeting every week, and I've got circulation, I've got advertising, I've got production, and we talk about things that are happening. If the ad director is concerned about a story that we do, she calls me. If I know that we're going to be doing a story about a big advertiser, I'll call her and say, hey, I just want you to know, that this might happen. I've called her before when, we were going to have, bad news on the front page, and I knew that there was an ad down here at the bottom, from a similar advertiser, if not the same one. So there is interaction. Native advertising, what I say in our meetings is that, I want it to be clearly labeled as advertising. I'm not, we have kind of fought the fights, and we've lost some battles, we've won some battles as far as the news side goes. And, I think everybody, I have a great medium. I've got a website, I've got a magazine, I've got a print product, so I've got a great medium for telling stories. I just want it to be distinct as to what is news and what is not.
I'll just follow my flippant original answer with, I never want to deceive my readers. right? And I also talk to our ad director on a regular basis. We try not to blindside each other, but he understands that where my wall is not going to move is that I am not going to deceive my readers, right? And when you start talking about native content or we used to talk about advertorials or whatever version of that is resurfacing this decade because there's nothing new about it. What it comes down to for me is this an attempt to deceive my readers? Is this an attempt to trick them? And if it is, I want no part of it. If it's clear what it is, I don't have an issue with it.
Being truthful and trusted is what separates us from everything else out there. And we don't win when we trick or deceive, in our case, readers. So everything, as Susan mentioned, everything has to be clearly labeled.
And you guys do a great job with that.
People need to know when they're moving from editorial to advertising. Good questions.
Not always clear. I know there are shows on TV now that are like Good Day Tulsa, for example, the show that comes on at 9 o'clock, they have sole segments that look like news segments, and it's somewhere they say that, but it was never created to be a news show. But sometimes it's anchored by news anchors, and you see the same weather guy, but there are distinctions there, but I'm not sure that the viewers understand that. I see other shows, travel shows and things like that, are obviously paid for by somebody. I know the OCO, I just talked to Amanda Clinton, who's the Vice President of Communications for the Cherokee tribe, and they buy that time for the OCO show. It looks just like a news program, and I don't think people distinguish it as different than another news magazine type program. So I agree with the more it's labeled very clearly that this is a paid-for program, the better off we are.
Well, I've got 1 o'clock on my watch, and we want to honor your time commitment here. So again, thank you for the questions, and I want to thank our panel. They were great and gave us some good insight.